America is known for many things, like its pop culture, expressed in music, television shows, and movies. More importantly, Americans are known for their strong sense of individuality, freedom, and creativity. But all of these take roots in the rich history and culture of Native Americans, which many people don't know about. Who were the first Americans, and what were they like? Let's find out. Hi, welcome to our channel. Today we'll be discussing an interesting topic in history, particularly about the Native Americans. Native Americans are considered the original peoples of the Americas. The term is often used specifically for groups that lived in what is now Canada and the United States, but most people still don't know their history and culture. In this video, we'll help you get to know and study them better. Before we start, what facts have you heard about the Native Americans before? Can you tell us in the comments below? Now, let's begin. Many years before Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas, America was discovered by the nomadic ancestors of today's Native Americans. They crossed a land bridge from Asia to Alaska over 12,000 years ago. When European explorers reached the Americas in the 15th century, it's estimated that over 50 million people were already living there, with around 10 million in what is now the United States. Over time, these people and their descendants moved south and east, adapting along the way. To better understand these diverse groups, anthropologists and geographers have organized them into culture areas, rough groupings of neighboring peoples who shared similar environments and characteristics. North America, excluding present-day Mexico, is typically divided into 10 separate culture areas: the Arctic, the Subarctic, the Northeast, the Southeast, the Plains, the Southwest, the Great Basin, California, the Northwest Coast, and the Plateau. While the exact population of Native Americans in 1492 is uncertain, it was in the millions, dispelling the notion of empty lands in the Americas. The region was home to at least 2,000 distinct languages, reflecting marked cultural differences. Some Native American groups were small bands of hunters and gatherers, while others practiced sophisticated, irrigated agriculture. Various complex, agriculturally based cultures emerged, including the Mayas and Aztecs in Mesoamerica, the Incas in Peru, and the mound builders and Mississippians in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. As the European conquest of the Americas began in the early 16th century CE, indigenous peoples were widespread across the Western Hemisphere. Unfortunately, they faced devastating consequences such as epidemic diseases, military conquest, and enslavement. Similar to other colonized groups, they endured discriminatory political and legal practices well into the 20th and even the 21st century. Despite these challenges, Indigenous peoples have been notably proactive and successful in bringing about political transformations and reclaiming autonomy in areas like education, land ownership, religious freedom, legal rights, and the revitalization of their traditional cultures. Before we get to know the 10 different cultural areas, tell us in the comments below. What are your thoughts on the Native Americans so far? Now, let's get to know the 10 different cultural areas, one by one. The Arctic culture area, located near the Arctic Circle in present-day Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, is a cold, flat, treeless region often described as a frozen desert. It was inhabited by the Inuit and the Aleut, both of whom spoke and continue to speak dialects derived from the Eskimo-Aleut language family. Due to its harsh conditions, the Arctic had a relatively small and scattered population. Some groups, particularly the Inuit in the northern part, were nomadic, following migrating seals, polar bears, and other game across the tundra. In the southern part, the Aleut were somewhat more settled, residing in small fishing villages along the shore. By the time the United States acquired Alaska in 1867, the native population had significantly declined to just 2,500 due to years of oppression and exposure to European diseases. The descendants of these survivors still inhabit the area today. Then, the subarctic culture area, characterized by swampy pine forests and waterlogged tundra, extended across much of inland Alaska and Canada. Travel in this region was challenging, with toboggans, snowshoes, and lightweight canoes serving as the main modes of transportation. The population was sparse, and rather than forming large permanent settlements, the peoples of the subarctic typically stayed in small family groups as they followed herds of caribou. They lived in easily portable tents and lean-tos, and during extremely cold periods, they sought refuge in underground dugouts. The emergence of the fur trade in the 17th and 18th centuries disrupted the traditional subarctic way of life. Instead of relying on hunting and gathering for sustenance, the indigenous people shifted their focus to supplying pelts to European traders. This shift eventually led to the displacement and extermination of many native communities in the region. Then we have the Northeast culture area, among the first to encounter Europeans, spanned from the Atlantic coast of present-day Canada to North Carolina, and inland to the Mississippi River Valley. It consisted of two main groups: the Iroquoian speakers, mostly residing along inland rivers and lakes in fortified, politically stable villages, and the more numerous Algonquian speakers living in small farming and fishing villages along the ocean, where they cultivated crops like corn, beans, and vegetables. Conflict was already prevalent in the Northeast culture area, with the Iroquoian groups known for their aggressiveness and warlike tendencies. Bands and villages outside of their allied confederacies were frequently targeted in raids. The arrival of European colonizers added complexity, as colonial wars compelled the region's indigenous people to choose sides, leading to conflicts between Iroquois groups and their Algonquian neighbors. As white settlement expanded westward, both sets of indigenous people were eventually displaced from their lands. Next, the Southeast culture area, situated between the Gulf of Mexico and the Northeast, was a humid and fertile agricultural region. Many of its inhabitants were skilled farmers, cultivating staple crops like maize, beans, squash, tobacco, and sunflower. Their lives were centered around small ceremonial and market villages known as hamlets. Notable among the southeastern indigenous peoples are the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, collectively referred to as the Five Civilized Tribes, with some speaking a variant of the Muscovian language. By the time the United States gained independence from Britain, the Southeast culture area had already experienced significant loss of native populations due to disease and displacement. In 1830, the Federal Indian Removal Act mandated the relocation of the remaining members of the Five Civilized Tribes to make way for white settlers. Between 1830 and 1838, federal authorities compelled nearly 100,000 indigenous people to move out of the southern states to Indian Territory, which was later Oklahoma, west of the Mississippi. The Plains culture area, meanwhile, encompasses the expansive prairie territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, extending from present-day Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Prior to the arrival of European traders and explorers, the region's inhabitants, who spoke Siouan, Algonquian, Caddoan, Uto-Aztecan, and Athabascan languages, were relatively settled hunters and farmers. However, European contact, particularly the introduction of horses by Spanish colonists in the 18th century, led to a significant shift towards a more nomadic lifestyle for the peoples of the Great Plains. By the late 19th century, white sport hunters had nearly decimated the buffalo herds in the region. Faced with settlers encroaching on their lands and limited economic opportunities, Plains natives were compelled to relocate to government reservations. Moving to the Southwest culture area, it is a vast desert region spanning present-day Arizona and New Mexico, as well as parts of Colorado, Utah, Texas, and Mexico, developed two distinct ways of life. Sedentary farmers, including the Hopi, Zuni, Yaqui, and Yuma, cultivated crops like corn, beans, and squash. Many of them resided in permanent settlements called pueblos, constructed from stone and adobe. These pueblos featured multi-story dwellings that resembled apartment houses. In contrast, other southwestern peoples like the Navajo and the Apache led more nomadic lifestyles, relying on hunting, gathering, and raiding established neighbors for crops. By the time the southwestern territories became part of the United States following the Mexican War, many of the region's native people had already perished. In the latter half of the 19th century, the federal government relocated most of the remaining natives in the region to reservations. Next is the Great Basin Culture Area, a vast basin enclosed by the Rocky Mountains to the east, the Sierra Nevadas to the west, the Columbia Plateau to the north, and the Colorado Plateau to the south. Consisted of arid landscapes including deserts, salt flats, and brackish lakes. Its inhabitants, predominantly speaking Shoshonean or Uto-Aztecan dialects, relied on foraging for roots, seeds, and nuts, as well as hunting snakes, lizards, and small mammals. Following European contact, some Great Basin groups acquired horses and formed equestrian hunting and raiding bands, resembling those associated with the Great Plains natives. With the discovery of gold and silver by white prospectors in the mid-19th century, many of the Great Basin's people lost their land and often their lives. Temperate California, on the other hand, prior to European contact, boasted a larger population than any other North American region, with around 300,000 people in the mid-16th century. Approximately 100 different tribes and groups, speaking over 200 dialects, contributed to this remarkable diversity. Despite the varied languages, many native Californians led similar lives, emphasizing a lack of substantial agriculture. Instead, they organized into small, family-based bands of hunter-gatherers known as tribalettes. Spanish explorers entered the California region in the mid-16th century. In 1769, the cleric Junipero Serra established a mission in San Diego, marking the beginning of a particularly harsh period. Forced labor, disease, and assimilation during this time nearly wiped out the native population of the culture area. Meanwhile, the Northwest Coast Culture Area, spanning the Pacific coast from British Columbia to the northern tip of California, enjoys a temperate climate and a wealth of natural resources. The region's oceans and rivers, in particular, provided an abundance of essentials for its people, including salmon, whales, sea otters, seals, and various types of fish and shellfish. In contrast to many other hunter-gatherer societies that faced challenges in sustaining themselves and had to move in pursuit of animal herds, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest were secure enough to establish permanent villages, each accommodating hundreds of individuals. Lastly, the Plateau Culture Area was situated in the Columbia and Fraser River basins, encompassing the regions where the subarctic, the plains, the Great Basin, California, and the Northwest Coast intersected. The majority of its inhabitants resided in small, tranquil villages along streams and riverbanks, sustaining themselves through activities such as fishing for salmon and trout, as well as hunting and gathering wild berries, roots, and nuts. In 1805, explorers Lewis and Clark passed through this area, followed by an increasing influx of white settlers. By the late 19th century, most remaining members of plateau tribes had been displaced from their lands and relocated to government reservations. And that's it. Those were the 10 different cultural areas of Native Americans. Did you take down notes from the list? What was the most interesting fact you learned about them? Tell us in the comments below. If you enjoyed watching this video, click like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thanks for watching.